Hello, learners. Welcome to the 24th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century English novel, as found in the work of a group of women writers. I have been talking about Zora Neale Hurston as a way to build the context for her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. I mentioned briefly about Hurston's birth in Alabama and how several sources have instead identified Florida, and particularly Eatonville, Florida, as her place of birth. Eatonville, Florida is a place that Hurston moved to after a few years in Alabama, and it is the setting for Their Eyes Were Watching God. And so that is why several biographers as well as scholars have identified her place and date of birth somewhat incorrectly. Hurston was born, as I mentioned, in Alabama on January 7th, 1891. Both her parents had been slaves. At a young age, her family relocated to Eatonville, Florida, where they flourished. Eventually, her father became one of the town's first mayors. In 1917, Hurston enrolled at Morgan College, where she completed her high school studies. She then attended Howard University and earned an associate's degree. Hurston was an active student and participated in student government. While at Howard, which is an HBCU, or a historically black college and university, she also co-founded the school's renowned newspaper, The Hilltop. In 1925, Hurston received a scholarship to Barnard College and graduated 3 years later with a bachelor's in anthropology. During her time as a student in New York City, Hurston befriended other writers such as Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen, and almost every other cultural luminary of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, it's important to note a couple of things before understanding the particular intellectual context which shapes the way Hurston described the people and places in Their Eyes Were Watching God. The education and professional development that Hurston undertook in New York was tinged with a great deal of suspicion, and the suspicion was directed at some of the key tendencies in the Harlem Renaissance. And chiefly the key tendency in that cultural movement was an affirmative treatment of race, and particularly an affirmative treatment of blackness. Negritude became a term of political empowerment, and several writers, most famously Alan Locke, and who advocated for writers, black writers, to not try and create an aesthetic that was defined by white writers, but rather to create an aesthetic that was uniquely sensitive to the experiences of black people. It was this tendency towards which Hurston expressed more than a little suspicion. She used words like negrotarians. For Hurston, negrotarian described blacks who felt they had to launder their image in order to be accepted by white society. In New York, she met other black writers and soon became known as the Queen of the Niggerati. These are all expressions and quotes from Hurston's biography, autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. This was a time when several black writers argued for the creation of a uniquely black aesthetic, and it was something that Hurston found it very difficult to reconcile with what she understood as the very ambitious, very intellectually very powerful and challenging goals of fiction as a literary art. According to Hurston, fiction had some very ambitious goals, and it had the power to interrogate meaningfully and reshape the conditions as well as the experiences in which black people found themselves. However, if fiction and literary art were defined in a very reductive way simply by race, then it would become more like a performance. It would lose its ability to be truly curious and to explore fearlessly the purely intellectual basis of one's existence. And so in this movement, there were several writers, and one very powerful writer and influential editor was Nancy Cunard, who in 1934 published an anthology titled Negro. This was a landmark publication because it included work from almost every cultural luminary of her time, and a list that I have put together of the writers who were published in this anthology were William Carlos Williams, Langston Hughes, V.F. Calverton, Anna Bontrams, Ezra Pound, Josephine Herbst, County Cullen, Theodore Dreiser, Sterling Brown, Alain Locke, Jomo Kenyatta, Harold Acton, Hurston herself, and several others. But this anthology was not received very well. In fact, many Black writers described it as a failure and as a flop. And Sterling Brown had the most caustic words about this when he described it thus. When we cease to be exotic, Brown wrote in 1942, we do not sell well. So this anthology evidenced what had been suspected by critical thinkers such as Hurston, which was that all this talk about negritude, all this talk about blackness, all this talk about creating black-oriented or black-centric art as opposed to telling stories or simply telling stories that people sell and people would want to buy. It was not a sustainable idea to define narrative in a reductive way simply by the race of the person telling the story. It was not sustainable because it assumed that blackness was exotic, and it assumed that the people with the power to produce writing and the people with the power to support this industry of writing, that is, buy books, were mostly white who would be interested in blackness because it was black, because it was exotic. And that is the logic of this very unsustainable idea, which Hurston had identified with a great deal of suspicion much earlier. Now, in addition to Hurston's disagreements with and Hurston's suspicion of the Harlem Renaissance, or one very dominant tendency within the Harlem Renaissance, there was also Hurston's somewhat tense and somewhat difficult position within the intellectual context of early 20th century anthropology. Hurston majored in anthropology in college at Harvard University and went on to study anthropology for her PhD as well. Hurston was the only Black student at Barnard College in 1925, where she became a dedicated student of anthropology under the legendary professor Franz Boas. Franz Boas was then at Columbia University and would later go on to fundamentally reshape the way the discipline of anthropology staked its intellectual claims. Boas is today known as the pioneer of deep fieldwork and the author of books such as The Mind of Primitive Man, published 1911. Now, Boas faulted white anthropologists for judging different peoples by values that may not be universally applicable. He argued that cultures must be evaluated according to how well people had adapted to their environments. Now, very briefly, prior to Franz Boas, there was a tendency to view different cultures or cultures in which people lived in ways that were different from the way people lived in white, modern, industrialized or post-industrial Christian, Anglo-Saxon, Caucasian America. So every form of life that was different from this very narrowly defined normal, that is white American, middle class, etc., tended to be seen as primitive. And Boas voiced a very strong challenge against such definition. According to Boas, there was nothing that was absolutely primitive. In fact, there were only relative definitions of primitivism or modernity because people were evolving and practices were evolving in relation to changing circumstances. Now, because of this, a different idea of collective memory began to be quite popular and established while Hurston was doing her research. So, in Hurston's day, anthropologists, for the most part, saw folklore as specific to sequestered communities and as collective memory from which the shape of the past could be inferred. Folk culture back then was defined as something impossible to sustain in any environment other than an isolated, impervious locale. Literacy and migration, things normally associated in Black culture with progress, choice, and getting away from the South, supposedly undermined the fabric of those locales where a folk culture flourished. So there was a contradiction because if Hurston were to be an anthropologist with these beliefs in the way that 20th century anthropology worked, then she would have to describe the folk culture that she had observed as tragic in some way, or she would have to describe the practices of the Black vernacular culture as being the remnants of poverty and somehow struggling to survive in a world that was not very sympathetic to them. As opposed to this, Hurston's impulse was to pay attention to this culture as it saw itself. She wanted to describe the Black vernacular culture and folk culture as something which was quite vibrant and active in itself. She did not want to define this culture from a perspective that assumed that whiteness was normal. And so there led to this contradiction in which Hurston was frequently re-evaluating and challenging the ideas that she had trained with. And so in the established scholarly wisdom of Hurston's time, rural people were the stewards of vanishing customs and beliefs, while the past was being lost because of accelerated social transformation. Now, in this idea, to assume that this is true for all cultures, all societies, all races, itself assumes that whiteness is normal and that every other culture must be a victim of poverty. As opposed to this idea, Hurston developed a perspective in which things like hoodoo were not simply struggles for survival, but ways or strategies that people had developed and which were actually giving meaning and sometimes even pleasure to individuals. Now, Hurston was born in the American South, and as a child of the Black American culture down south, when she wanted to study, she greatly appealed to Boas because his anthropological relativism stressed understanding a given culture from the inside rather than by viewing it from the outside. So theoretically, Boas's method was perfectly suited to the kind of observation, to the kind of description, to the kind of realistic fiction writing that Hurston wanted to do. In fact, it was perfectly suited to developing styles of paying attention that the best literary fiction is able to do. While this was theoretically true, when Hurston actually began to do the research, actually began to apply for resources and funding and money to travel to the South, to perform field work, to actually observe and interview people and live with them in order to write about them, Hurston found that she was hitting a roadblock. She was hitting a ceiling because a lot of her ideas of writing did not align with the established scholarly wisdom of anthropology. Chiefly, Hurston did not want to use a lot of contemporary anthropological theory. Hurston wanted to simply go to these places, that is New Orleans, Florida, and later islands in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica and Haiti, and to simply observe these people and these cultures with the ideas that Boas had established. She did not want to keep using the theoretical ideas and to keep trying to understand these cultures using the words and the thoughts from Boas. And this led to a lot of disagreement and often led to alienation. In many instances, Hurston was refused funding and had to fall back on benefactors, wealthy white people who believed or who had interest in understanding Black cultures, and thereby reinforcing and repeating that cycle of something that is found valuable because it appears exotic. Now, but to describe further what was in Franz Boas's theory that was so useful to Hurston, it was the temperament of the observer, the degree of sympathy, and the absence of condescension. These were important to a method of cultural analysis that depended on descriptive information. Boas instructed Hurston to pay attention to the behavior of people when they told a story, as well as to the stories being told. That is, it's not just the information or the fact or the meaning of a cultural practice. Those things were important, obviously, but sometimes equally or even more important than this kind of cultural information was the tone, the tenor, the texture, and the feeling of a person talking about their culture. Hurston recognized this approach to anthropology as a way of asserting Black vernacular culture's worth, even while Boas and his students were criticized within the discipline for not being rigorous enough. And in fact, quite a few Black intellectuals, contemporaries of Hurston, criticized her own writing as not being critical enough, as not being rigorous enough. Richard Wright called Hurston's descriptions of Black people minstrel-like, which is to say that they were spiritualized, that they were designed to make people feel good. And so they were like those universal spiritual songs that used to describe the experience of slavery and the Middle Passage. In Richard Wright's perspective, who was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party at the time, from Richard Wright's view, descriptions of Black people in a novel by a writer who was part of the Harlem Renaissance should have been more violent, should have been more critical, because that was the only way that writing could inspire social change. And in addition to this, there were other scholars also who found that Hurston's writing about Black people in her nonfiction, and she published quite a few works of ethnography as well. In her nonfictional works of ethnography, also, the writer Sterling Brown argued that Hurston's writing was not bitter enough. Bitterness was a politically useful emotion, and many Black writers felt disappointed that Hurston's writing was not bitter enough. These are all ideas we'll find very useful as we begin to encounter Hurston's writing, but before we actually get to The Eyes Were Watching God, which was published in the year 1936, I want to take us through a brief detour because the fiction for which Hurston is known today, the novel The Eyes Were Watching God, actually was written in the middle of a process of evolution in which Hurston was actively striving to develop herself professionally as an anthropologist. While she was developing herself as an anthropologist, she was also developing a style of writing. And so when she found herself in Haiti for 6 weeks, she was on a fieldwork trip. She had gone to Haiti, she had received money from different wealthy sources which supported her as she presented her goal of researching and writing about cultures and practices of the Black vernacular community, which were not very well understood by those in the mainstream, more privileged and more dominant and white intellectual cultures. So that was the context, that was the frame, that was the means of production which allowed Hurston to travel to Haiti in 1935. And there, over a period of 6 weeks, Hurston wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God. That novel is not set in Haiti. It is set in her own hometown of Eatonville, Florida. But the way Their Eyes Were Watching God describes the speech of its characters. It is full of dialect, it is full of vernacular, to the extent that many readers of the English novel will be quite surprised to find that this is a novel that is routinely identified as being in English, when quite a bit of it is not really in standard English at all. It is in a vernacular which will take some time for readers to get used to. In fact, it is advisable to read some guides on how to understand Black vernacular of the deep South. Not just Black vernacular, but rural, the kind of English that's spoken by individuals in small villages in the Southern American states of Florida, Alabama, New Orleans, Mississippi, and so on. Without such a primer or such an introduction, it can be quite challenging to understand. But I will also say it will be challenging for only the first couple of pages. After that, any reader can very easily get a sense of this new language because it becomes very predictable. Words that are spelt in a particular way and that are pronounced in a particular way in Standard or Queen's English are pronounced and spelled slightly differently in Hurston's Black vernacular English. And readers will very quickly be able to make their way through this language. That said, there is a great deal of vernacular and there's a perspective, there is a worldview which teaches readers not just how to understand this language, but how to perceive the decisions and the choices made by individuals who speak this language. The novel, The Eyes Were Watching God, and I'll take a brief detour and give you a brief summary of the novel before describing the more detailed context of anthropology. The novel is a very unlikely candidate or a very unlikely text in this context of the Harlem Renaissance because the protagonist, Janie Crawford, is very different from the protagonist of a Harlem Renaissance novel who might be able to support an intellectual or cultural mission of protest. Quite a few writers were writing novels that had protagonists who very directly took on the mission of social change. And Janie Crawford is quite remarkable for being a little bit indifferent at best to questions of social change. The novel describes Janie's struggle to find an identity of herself. And this struggle, this journey becomes a struggle because of the kinds of failure Janie finds in successive relationships. These relationships are with men of different kind. They're with men of Black men of different economic, cultural, and social standing. And they all fail. They all end in tragedy. And the novel begins with Janie returning to her hometown, which is Eatonville, Florida, having left many years ago, having married a much younger man, and returning alone. When the novel opens, we see a group of people sitting on their porches, almost the entire town sitting on their porches, watching Janie walk back into this town. And every person, and especially the women, almost every woman, makes a very caustic, snide, malicious remark about the kind of failure Janie has ended up as. And Janie is a failure because she acted in ways that these other women could not act. Janie is a failure in their view because she thought that she might achieve something by taking decisions which were unconventional, which were different. But those decisions ended in failure and in tragedy. So this is the way the novel begins, and it's a very unlikely candidate because instead of social change or an articulation of why the material conditions of African Americans needed improvement, the novel argues for the importance of individuality. The novel educates readers in the necessity for making decisions for oneself And the novel ultimately consolidates the strength of one's identity. The novel is ultimately more about psychological realism, and it's about describing the difficulties that an individual Black woman might face in the early decades of the 20th century in America if she were to negotiate society, if she were to reconcile the demands that she perform a particular kind of identity, as well as if she were to remain true to herself. So it's a very strange kind of novel because it does not create opportunities for articulating protest in the way that a lot of other writers defined it. Now, to return to the work that Hurston was doing as an anthropologist, Hurston made several trips to the American South, and the initial trips ended in failure. The first trips ended in failure because she approached that village as a member of the Society of American Folklore, and in Hurston's words, she talked in a language that she calls carefully accented Bernardese. Bernardese refers to Barnard College, where she was a student, which is a part of Columbia University. The kinds of questions that Hurston was asking on her first trip did not place her in a very confident or comfortable place and did not induce a lot of confidence in her subjects. So, for instance, she asked subjects things like, "Pardon me, but do you know any folk songs or folk tales?" And this kind of novice or newbie or untrained approach meant that this first trip was a failure. And in order to return to the South, in order to keep doing this research, Hurston turned to a benefactress named Mrs. Osgood Mason. Mrs. Osgood Mason was one of those wealthy, white, influential people who were quite interested in the fate of the African American community. And it was with the assistance that Hurston got from Mrs. Mason that Hurston was able to travel. Now, it has recently come to light that Hurston signed a contract with Mrs. Mason, and as part of the contract, Hurston's intellectual work would be written and stored and would put with Mrs. Mason and would become the property of Mrs. Mason. The manuscripts from these first trips were stored in the archives and were recently discovered and published. And we get a very different idea of what Hurston published in her research on Black vernacular folklore and the kind of writing that Hurston had actually been doing. We also learned that Hurston had accumulated quite a bit of data and had enough to publish maybe 7 volumes. And this goes to show that Hurston had established something of a personal mission for herself, which was to present folklore as Black communities experienced it, neither intimidated nor dressed up nor mediated by an outsider. So this was something that did not exist. It was a real gap in the cultural context of her time. And the manuscripts of Hurston that have recently been discovered and republished tell us that a great deal of the intellectual development as a fiction writer that Hurston was undertaking at this time can be understood only if we acknowledge this very important mission of cultural education that Hurston had also begun to undertake. She wanted to educate the average reader, the common reader, as Virginia Woolf puts it, not in the social condition of Black people, but to inculcate an awareness and an understanding of folk culture as experienced by Black communities. I'll talk more about this intellectual goal and how it led to the development of Hurston's voice as a writer in the next lecture. Thank you.